The sickening force of a brutal shove shattered the refined elegance of the upscale mall's gala atrium. Isabella gasped, the air violently driven from her lungs as a heavy hand clamped ruthlessly onto the collar of her simple, elegant white blouse. The fabric strained against her throat as she was yanked backward, her modest grace disrupted as she stumbled into a glittering crystal display. For a suspended heartbeat, the bustling luxury corridor went deathly still. Nearby, a woman in a designer dress covered her mouth in sheer horror, while a businessman instinctively raised his phone, paralyzed by the sudden eruption of violence. Isabella looked up, her chest heaving and her eyes wide with shock. Staring down at her, his face contorted into an ugly, terrifying snarl of rage, was Victor, her ex-husband. The man who had stripped away her dignity, callously discarded her, and left her for dead in the unforgiving streets of Seoul years ago, fully believing she would simply disappear. "Did you really think you could sneak into a place like this, Isabella?" Victor hissed, his grip tightening on her collar as he leaned in to assert his old dominance. He puffed out his chest, desperate to impress his wealthy associates, entirely blind to the imposing, dark-suited men silently stepping out of the shadows behind him. "Look at you, still a pathetic nobody trying to blend in with your betters." High above the sprawling, neon-lit labyrinth of Seoul, the penthouse was a fortress woven of cashmere and quiet. Isabella stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city reduced to a glittering carpet of diamonds beneath her bare feet. The glass was cool to the touch and completely impenetrable, much like the reality her husband had painstakingly constructed for her. Here, as the cherished wife of Ji-hoon, the city's most formidable underground king, she was utterly untouchable. Yet, even wrapped in the flawless silk of her current existence, the ghosts of her past refused to be fully exorcised. She called it the phantom sensation. It would strike her in the most pristine moments, a sudden, visceral memory of freezing concrete seeping through thin soles, the gnawing hollow of a starving stomach, the paralyzing terror of being entirely abandoned. Years ago, Victor had thrown her to the wolves in the unforgiving underbelly of this very city, wiping his hands of her existence with a cruel laugh. He had left her to perish in the dirt so he could climb the social ladder unburdened by a wife he deemed worthless. Isabella closed her eyes, pulling her plush robe tighter around her shoulders as an involuntary shiver racked her frame. The penthouse was perfectly climate-controlled, guarded by an invisible army of loyal men who answered only to Ji-hoon. But the chill she felt was internal. It was the lingering, icy grip of her former vulnerability. Ji-hoon had pulled her from the wreckage, placing her on a pedestal so high no one could reach her. But the mind was a treacherous thing. Sometimes the absolute safety of her new life felt like a silk prison. The sheer weight of Ji-hoon's protective shadow, though born of a fierce and desperate love, was a constant reminder of the fragility she was trying so hard to outgrow. She didn't want to just be a powerful man's fragile treasure. She needed to prove to herself that the terrified, broken woman Victor had discarded was truly dead and gone. That was why she had insisted on attending the high-end charity gala tonight, slipping into a modest white blouse and simple skirt rather than the ostentatious couture her husband provided. She craved a fleeting moment of quiet independence, a brief foray into the world without the heavy perimeter of her security detail. She wanted to breathe the air of the city that had almost destroyed her and know she had survived it. Stepping away from the window, Isabella began to prepare for the evening, completely unaware that her quiet assertion of independence would soon violently collide with the architect of her deepest nightmares. She was stepping out of the fortress, descending right back into the world where Victor still believed he was a predator. In the command center of a blacked-out office building overlooking the Han River, Ji-hoon sat in a high-backed leather chair, his silhouette a sharp blade against the glow of dozens of monitors. His eyes, dark and unblinking, never left the screen tracking Isabella's movement. To the world, he was a ghost, a ruthless kingpin who moved the city's tectonic plates with a single whisper. To Isabella, he was her savior, but beneath the surface of his devotion lay a vow of ice, a cold, absolute determination that no hand would ever lay a finger on her again without being severed from its arm. He watched her through the high-definition lenses of the mall's security network, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, predatory beat on the mahogany desk. He had granted her this night of independence, but Ji-hoon did not believe in accidents. He believed in contingencies. Every step she took was shadowed by men who didn't exist, eyes that didn't blink, and a digital tether that reported her heart rate directly to his watch. His fierce, silent preservation was not merely about safety, it was a reclamation. When he had found her years ago, she was a broken bird in the gutter, her spirit nearly extinguished by the man who should have protected her. Ji-hoon had spent every day since then rebuilding her, piece by agonizing piece, shielding her with a wall of steel and emeralds. He studied the way she moved through the mall, the subtle tilt of her head, the way she clutched her handbag. He could see the phantom weight she still carried, the lingering trauma of the woman Victor had tried to destroy. "Target is approaching the atrium," a voice crackled through his earpiece. It was Min-ho, his lead security detail, invisible among the shoppers. Ji-hoon leaned forward, his jaw tightening. He saw the flicker of a familiar face on a secondary screen, a man in a branded jacket, radiating a desperate, cheap arrogance. Victor. The air in the command center seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ji-hoon didn't move, but the temperature of his gaze turned lethal. He had known this day might come, the moment the past tried to drag his queen back into the mud. He watched as Victor stepped into Isabella's path, his face twisting into that familiar, condescending sneer. Ji-hoon's hand hovered over a crimson button on his console, his pulse steady, but his heart a furnace of cold fury. He wouldn't stop her yet. He knew Isabella needed to face her demon, but as he watched Victor reach out, his own vow of ice crystallized into a promise of total annihilation. If Victor wanted to remind Isabella of who she used to be, Ji-hoon would show Victor exactly who he was about to become, a memory. The air in the atrium was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. But as Isabella turned the corner near a display of handcrafted watches, a different smell cut through the fragrance. It was a sharp, aggressive mix of sandalwood and expensive tobacco, the scent of a nightmare she had spent years trying to scrub from her skin. Before she could even register the source, a sound tore through the polished atmosphere. It was a sharp, jagged bray of a laugh, dripping with a condescending mirth that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was Victor's laugh. It was the sound he made when he watched her cry over their empty bank accounts, the sound he made as he slammed the door of their apartment for the last time, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Isabella froze. The phantom sensation of the cold sole pavement rushed back with such violence that the marble floor beneath her feet seemed to turn to ice. Her breath hitched, catching in a throat that suddenly felt constricted by invisible hands. She shouldn't have come. The independence she had craved felt like a foolish, fragile whim in the face of the man who had been her primary architect of pain. She watched him from a distance, standing among a group of middle-aged businessmen. Victor looked different, yet exactly the same. He was dressed in a jacket that screamed of brand names and desperate wealth, his posture strained in an effort to look like he belonged in a world he was clearly struggling to inhabit. He was a social climber, a man who traded in shadows and false promises, still trying to buy the respect he could never earn. As if sensing her gaze, Victor's head snapped toward her. For a moment, his eyes narrowed, searching for the face that didn't fit the luxury of his surroundings. Then recognition ignited in his pupils, not with warmth, but with a predatory, twisted delight. He didn't see the wife of the city's most powerful man. He didn't see the woman who had rebuilt her soul from ash. He saw the charity case. He saw the girl he had broken. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a sneer that twisted his features into a mask of pure disdain. He began to walk toward her, his stride aggressive and entitled. With every step he took, the walls of the atrium seemed to close in on Isabella. The security detail was there, she knew. Ji-hoon was watching. But in this moment, the trauma was a private ocean, and Victor was the tide coming to pull her under once again. Victor didn't just walk. He invaded her space like a predator reclaiming a lost kill. The distance between them vanished in a blur of branded fabric and unbridled malice. Before Isabella could find her voice, his hand shot out, thick fingers bunching the delicate silk of her white blouse and slamming her back against a marble pillar. The impact rattled her teeth, the cold stone a harsh contrast to the heat of Victor's sudden, violent proximity. "I asked you a question, you pathetic leech," Victor roared, his voice booming through the hallowed, silent corridors of the luxury wing. He didn't care who saw. In his mind, he was finally the man of power he had always dreamed of being, and Isabella was the perfect prop to prove his dominance. He leaned in until she could feel the spray of his spit on her cheek, his face a contorted mask of the man she had once mistakenly loved. "Do you have any idea whose air you're breathing? You think a cheap skirt and a fake smile make you belong here? You're a stain on this floor." Around them, the wealthy associates Victor had been desperate to impress watched with a mixture of morbid curiosity and disgust. One man, a few feet away, didn't try to help. Instead, he raised his smartphone, the lens a cold glass eye capturing Isabella's terror for a fleeting moment of internet notoriety. The humiliation was total. The public stage, the physical violation, the crushing weights of the past trying to drown her once again. Isabella's hand went instinctively to her throat, her fingers brushing against the hidden emergency transmitter, disguised as a modest silver pendant. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. She looked into Victor's eyes and saw nothing but the hollow rot of a man who needed to crush others to feel tall. Miles away, in the Silence Command Center, the atmosphere shifted from predatory observation to absolute zero. A rhythmic, piercing red light began to pulse on Ji-hoon's desk, reflecting in the dark glass of his pupils. On his phone, a single notification banner cut through the security feeds in bold, uncompromising text. Code Black. The fierce, silent preservation was over. The vow of ice had shattered, leaving only the sharp, jagged edges of a king's wrath. Ji-hoon stood, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. He didn't need to bark orders. His men were already moving, a synchronized machine of retribution. As Victor raised his hand to strike again, completely intoxicated by his own perceived power, he had no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant. The red pulse on Ji-hoon's phone was the last heartbeats of Victor as he knew it. Victor's hand remained suspended in the air, a trembling fist of unearned fury. He was mid-sentence, a jagged insult dying on his tongue as a sudden, unnatural silence swept through the atrium. It wasn't the silence of polite observation. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a landslide. The onlookers, the socialites, even the man with the smartphone, everyone froze, their gazes pulled toward the main entrance as if by a magnetic force. The rhythmic, metallic click of polished Oxfords against the marble floor echoed like a countdown. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp black suits moved with the terrifying precision of a military unit, silently parting the crowd. They didn't push, they simply existed with a gravity that forced the world to yield. At the center of this dark sun moved a figure who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Ji-hoon appeared like a shadow manifesting from the light. He walked with the slow, deliberate grace of a king surveying a battlefield that had already been won. His long coat billowed behind him, a dark shroud that seemed to swallow the ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers. When he reached the perimeter of the confrontation, he stopped. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a cold, kinetic energy. Victor's grip on Isabella's collar slackened, his fingers going numb as the primitive centers of his brain screamed a warning. He looked at Ji-hoon, the sharp jawline, the eyes like shards of frozen obsidian, and for the first time, the reality of the food chain became agonizingly clear. Victor was a scavenger who had mistaken himself for a hunter, but he had just stepped into the den of the city's apex predator. The branded jacket Victor wore suddenly looked like a cheap, desperate costume, his arrogance a paper shield in a firestorm. Ji-hoon didn't spare a glance for the crowd or the cameras. His gaze was fixed entirely on Isabella, his eyes searching hers with a terrifyingly quiet intensity. He saw the frantic rise and fall of her chest, the red mark beginning to bloom on her skin where Victor had gripped her, and the tears she refused to let fall. In that moment, the temperature of the room didn't just drop, it died. "Let her go," Ji-hoon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an absolute decree. It was a sound that didn't invite argument or negotiation. It was the sound of a man who owned the very ground Victor stood on, and as Ji-hoon took one single, predatory step forward, Victor realized with a jolt of pure terror that he was no longer the one in control. He was merely an obstacle waiting to be cleared. Victor's hand fell away from Isabella as if scorched. He stumbled back, his face flushing a mottled, angry purple as he tried to reclaim the shredded remnants of his dignity. To Victor, Ji-hoon was just another well-dressed intruder, perhaps a bodyguard or a mid-level enforcer for the mall's management. He had no idea he was staring into the eyes of the man who held the city's pulse in his palm. "You have a lot of nerve," Victor spat, his voice cracking with a desperate, thin bravado. He smoothed the lapels of his branded jacket, eyes darting to the crowd to ensure they were still watching. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm a personal guest of the developers. Do you have any idea what happens to people who interfere with my business? You'll be lucky to find a job cleaning toilets when I'm through with you." Ji-hoon didn't blink. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching Victor with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a terminal virus. He didn't offer a name or a title. He didn't need to. The silence he projected was more deafening than any threat Victor could scream. Trembling with a mix of rage and mounting unease, Victor reached into his pocket and yanked out his smartphone. "Fine, you want to play the hero? Let's see how long your tough guy act lasts." He punched a speed dial contact, holding the phone to his ear with a smug, trembling grin. "Hello? Director Park? Yes, it's Victor. I'm at the atrium. Some street thug is harassing me. I need security cleared out and this man dealt with immediately. Yes, I'll wait." Victor lowered the phone, his sneer returning as he looked at Ji-hoon. "Director Park is on his way down. He handles the security for this entire district. If I were you, I'd start running." Across the room, a subtle vibration hummed in the pocket of one of Ji-hoon's men. Ji-hoon didn't look away from Victor, but a ghost of a smile, cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth, touched his lips. He finally spoke, his voice a low melodic rumble that sent a fresh wave of ice down Isabella's spine. "Director Park is a very busy man, Victor. It would be a shame to waste his final moments on a phone call." The confusion on Victor's face was momentary, quickly replaced by a sickening realization as he saw Director Park appear at the edge of the crowd. The man wasn't looking at Victor with the usual professional deference. Instead, Park was deathly pale, his hands shaking as he bypassed Victor entirely. He stopped 3 paces from Ji-hoon and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the marble floor. Victor's phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the stone, the silent, dead line a perfect metaphor for the life he was about to lose. Ji-hoon did not wait for Victor to find his voice. He stepped into the man's personal space, a move so invasive it felt like a physical blow. The air around them grew impossibly thin as Ji-hoon reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from Victor's throat, before settling with terrifying gentleness on the lapel of the branded jacket. He smoothed the fabric with a clinical precision that made Victor's knees buckle. "Let's settle your accounts, Victor." Ji-hoon whispered, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the atrium like a scalpel. "The audit has begun." He began to recite the history Victor thought he had buried in the shadows of another continent. He spoke of the rainy night in Atlanta 5 years ago, when Victor had drained the joint savings accounts while Isabella was at her mother's funeral. He detailed the fresh start in Seoul that had been nothing more than a trap, the way Victor had led her to a desolate street corner in Myeongdong and simply walked away, leaving her with a dead cell phone and the clothes on her back. "You stole her security," Ji-hoon said, his eyes narrowing into 2 points of lethal light. "You stole her peace. You stole her future. You threw her into the gutter like a piece of refuse because you thought she had no value." Victor tried to stammer a defense, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the sound was strangled by the sheer weight of Ji-hoon's presence. Behind them, Director Park remained frozen in his deep bow, a silent testament to the absolute power Ji-hoon wielded. "In my world," Ji-hoon continued, his grip on the jacket tightening just enough to pull Victor onto his toes, "debt is a sacred thing. But the interest is what kills." He leaned in closer, his breath cold against Victor's ear. "You left her with nothing. So today, I apply 1,000% emotional interest. For every night she went hungry, I will strip a decade of work from your hands. For every hour she spent in terror, I will ensure a year of your own ruin. By the time I am finished with this audit, you won't just be poor, Victor. You will be a phantom, a ghost in a city that has forgotten your name, your face, and your very existence." Isabella stood behind her husband, her fingers brushing the fading red mark on her skin. Watching Victor, once her titan of terror, the man who had loomed so large in her nightmares, shrinking into a hollow shell under Ji-hoon's clinical assessment, she felt the last tether of her trauma snap. The debt was being called in, and the price was absolute. What remains for a man who has lost everything but the air in his lungs? The vibration of Victor's smartphone against the cold marble floor sounded like the buzzing of a dying insect. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the screen began to light up with a relentless barrage of notifications. Victor scrambled to pick it up, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it again. He expected support, a message from his lawyers or the confirmation of his deals. Instead, he saw the systematic evisceration of his existence. Transaction declined. Account frozen. Security access revoked. Each notification was a hammer blow to the foundation of his life. He swiped frantically, his eyes widening in terror as he watched his net worth spiral toward zero in real time. The offshore accounts he had used to hide the money he stole from Isabella were being liquidated, redirected into untraceable voids. The luxury hotel suite he had bragged about only minutes ago flashed a final, cruel update. Reservation canceled. Personal belongings removed to sidewalk. What did you do?" Victor whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up, seeking help from the wealthy associates he had been so desperate to impress. But the circle of influencers and businessmen had already widened. They didn't look at him with pity. They looked at him as if he were a contagion. They stepped back into the shadows of the atrium, their faces turning away, erasing him from their social memory before the digital erasure was even complete. Ji-hoon watched the collapse with a terrifying, calm detachment. "I didn't do anything you didn't earn, Victor. I simply accelerated the inevitable." A pair of mall security guards, acting on a silent signal from Director Park, stepped forward. They didn't treat Victor like the personal guest he had claimed to be. They gripped his arms with a clinical lack of emotion, lifting him from the floor. The branded jacket he had worn as armor was now just a pathetic rag. "Get him out of my sight," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice barely above a whisper.
and ensure he is barred from every establishment that bears my signature. From this moment on, he does not exist in this city." As Victor was dragged toward the service exit, stripped of his money, his reputation, and his borrowed power, he caught one last glimpse of Isabella. She was standing tall, her hand resting on Ji-hoon's barm, her eyes no longer filled with the reflected light of his cruelty. She looked at him not with hatred, but with the profound indifference one shows a stranger. The heavy steel doors of the service entrance swung shut, and with a final hollow thud, Victor was cast out. He stood on the damp sidewalk of a side street, the neon lights of Seoul flickering above him, as anonymous and broken as the woman he had abandoned on this very pavement 5 years ago. The cycle was complete. The charity case was now the queen, and the man who thought he owned the world was finally and truly a nobody. 6 months had passed since the marble corridors of the atrium echoed with Victor's screams. But today, the only sound in the Grand Seoul ballroom was the expectant hum of 1,000 influential guests. The air was no longer thick with the scent of sandalwood nightmares. It was bright, clear, and filled with the fragrance of white orchids. Isabella stood behind the curtain, looking down at her hand. The sunlight caught the facets of the ring on her finger, a band of obsidian and diamonds that served as both a promise and a shield. For years, she had worn it tucked away or turned inward, a secret kept in the shadows of the penthouse. Now, the metal felt warm against her skin, no longer a weight, but a source of grounded strength. When the moderator announced her name, Isabella didn't hesitate. She stepped onto the stage with a stride that was fluid and unwavering. The flashes of 100 cameras erupted like miniature stars, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer the broken girl from Myeongdong, nor was she the phantom hiding in a silk prison. She reached the podium and looked out over the sea of faces, the same elite circles that once would have stepped over her in the street. In the front row, Ji-hoon sat perfectly still. He didn't wear the cold, predatory mask of the underground king today. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her with a quiet, fierce pride that transcended power. He had given her the fortress, but she had found the keys herself. 6 months ago, I was invisible, Isabella began, her voice steady and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. She didn't use a script. She didn't need one. I lived in the silence of survival, but silence is not safety. True power isn't found in what we possess, but in our refusal to be erased. As she spoke, she officially launched the Rise Foundation, a massive initiative designed to provide legal, financial, and physical sanctuary for vulnerable women across the city. She wasn't just building shelters, she was building an empire of resilience. Behind her, a digital screen displayed the foundation's mission, backed by the immense resources of the city's most powerful networks. Isabella leaned into the microphone, her eyes shimmering with a hard, beautiful light. She was the architect of her own era now. The world would never again mistake her grace for weakness, nor her silence for submission. As she concluded her speech, the room erupted into a standing ovation, but Isabella's focus remained on the horizon she had finally claimed. The era of the victim was over. The era of Isabella had begun. And just like that, the woman Victor tried to erase became the one woman he can never forget. Isabella's journey from the cold streets of Seoul to the heights of power is a reminder that your past doesn't define your future. It only prepares you for the throne. But the story doesn't end here. We want to hear from you. Did Victor get what he deserved, or was Ji-hun's final audit too merciful? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Also, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this journey of resilience and revenge, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss a chapter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.